right. Well, since all of three of you are here, and we've got a decent, we got another one. We got a decent amount of people here watching. We're going to go ahead and get started. And as if people join as we get started, we will just make sure they get admitted to the meeting. So to start off, thank you all so much for joining us today to discuss DC statehood and its intersection with racial justice. If you are a member of Georgetown who has not yet joined the Statehood Club, please either message me, Alice, or Will your net ID, and we can make sure you're on the mailing list to find out about more events like this. Unfortunately, Dr. Cook, who was supposed to be the fourth panelist, couldn't make it today because he had a late family emergency. But we are joined today by three wonderful panelists. Hannah Docter-Loeb is the features editor at the Wesleyan Argus and a DC native who published an article for Study Breaks on this very question. Cosby Hunt is an adjunct professor at the University of the District of Columbia and the senior manager of social studies education at the Center for Inspired Learning. And Jamil Scott is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. And we're going to get started with a pretty broad question. And whenever we ask questions, whichever one of you guys feels inspired to can just jump in. And if no one starts talking, we'll try to call on one of you. So the first question we're going to get started with today is, what do you see as the connection between race and DC statehood, and how have your personal or professional experiences shaped that profession or that perception?
I'll start.
Go ahead, Jamil.
So when we think about DC in particular, its history as a Black and brown city, right? The implications of statehood, right, is really a question about representation and what that means for rights and privileges in Congress, et cetera, right? So what DC technically has in the moment through Eleanor Holmes Norton is kind of a shadow representative, right? That she's there, right? And people get to vote for her. But in terms of what she's able to do and contribute, like there's a power differential there, right? And so there are questions here about what representation could look like for DC, right? Particularly when we know, although DC has changed, right? Well, we used to call DC the chocolate city. Now it's more of the latte city, people would say, but there are implications here for representation, right? Particularly descriptive representation, when we know that for a long time, DC has elected a Black woman as a representative. So what could her impact be, right? If she was able to have a meaningful impact in, committee hearings, on the floor, et cetera, right? If her vote really counted in these spaces, right? And so, and I'd like to also extend this question to think about the fact that what happens in DC might also have implications for the territories of the United States as well, right? And we have to think about this as not just a DC struggle, right? This is a struggle for other marginalized folks who have some connection to the United States. That if we're talking about DC, then we inevitably might be thinking about a conversation about Guam, about Puerto Rico, right? And we already know what has happened in Puerto Rico. If you haven't paid attention to how, emergency services have been distributed or not to Puerto Rico, right? These types of things have, so I'm saying that to say, this isn't just an issue about Puerto Rico. I mean, not just an issue about DC, right, when we're talking about statehood, because inevitably, right, what happens in DC could have implications for what happens in the territories of the United States. So I'll leave it there.
I'll add a brief anecdote that connects a little bit to what Jamil just said. My wife and kids were vacationing in Tennessee. They went to a general store of some kind and bought, I guess my wife was buying some alcohol. And the woman said, I need to see some ID. And my wife gave her District of Columbia driver's license. I think you know where this is going. The woman said, oh, no, I'm gonna need to see a passport then. And I mean, my wife was like, she didn't really know what was going on at first, right? Like, passport, I'm just trying to buy some beer here. And the cashier literally did not recognize the District of Columbia driver's license, which is understandable. But sort of, so then the conversation went on, well, no, this is the District of Columbia, like the nation's capital. And the woman said, oh, you mean like up there near Connecticut or in Massachusetts? And it just sort of went downhill from there. And so my point is that obviously there's an uphill struggle about, I mean, there's statehood on the one hand, but there's like just the understanding that the District of Columbia, for some people, is a place in the United States where there are over 500,000 people who are disenfranchised. So I guess I'm saying that for some folks, we have to get back to some very basic education around what's happening here. And so in their minds, and this is where I'm trying to connect with Jamil, DC is no different than Guam or Puerto Rico in terms of people's understanding of like its relationship to the United States itself. So we've got our work cut out for us. But I do think that the taxation without representation license plates, when I'm traveling across the country, at least it gets people thinking like, oh, well, why does the DC plate say that?
I don't have much more to add than what Jamil and Cosby said, but it is this idea that there are 700,000 people in DC. And again, as Professor Scott pointed out, like it isn't as much of a chocolate city as it used to be, but a majority of these, I think it's like a 46% are Black and other distributions of different races and ethnicities who are being disenfranchised by the lack of statehood as well.
I guess we'll move on to our next question. And we touched on this a little bit, I think particularly in Jamil's answer. But how do you guys see the history of DC as a majority minority city impact efforts to gain statehood and gain recognition across the country?
I think it's mostly like out of, like, a lot of people I think that people, a lot of people think that DC, the reason why there's a lot of backlash about statehood is because of like the idea that like DC is what, 90% Democratic. It might be lower than that. And that is like why like we don't want more blue seats. But if you look back at the history of like DC, and there's like, you can read about like in the 1860s when DC was when there were slaves were emancipated and Black men won the right to vote, right? There were a lot of really racist people who were like, we don't want the Negroes to vote in DC because they're going to burn the city down. And there's this racist undertone throughout history against Black people voting in DC. And I think that definitely continues now. If you saw Tom Cotton's speech, I think it was in June, talking about like DC and governing of DC, I think it's still present as well.
I would agree with that point. I think that, again, these questions about DC statehood come back to representation and how people think about not just who represents DC, but also the implications for House control, for Senate control, right? And so for folks in the Republican Party and even in the Democratic Party, right, there are questions about what this means for them, right? Who holds control, right? Particularly in this time period where we're about to go into another presidential election cycle, right? And so whether or not, in thinking about this presidential election cycle, right, whether or not you see, President Trump getting elected again or not, right, which party holds control in the House or Senate can really have implications for what types of policies go through, what types of changes we see, particularly when we have some of these more active young legislators, rather representatives coming up in the House, right, and pushing for more progressive policies. And so who has control has implications for what types of policies we see come through.
I don't have much to add, although I do think that stories can be instructive. When DC was controlled by an all Southern contingent of members of the House, the Oversight Committee, in the 1960s, led by John McMillan of South Carolina. Walter Washington was our first Black mayor, appointed by the president. And when Walter Washington submitted his first budget to the House for approval, as the Constitution requires, McMillan sent Walter Washington, the mayor of the nation's capital, a truckload full of watermelons. So, you know, when you ask about what are the implications of a majority minority city, I mean, that's an example of, and what I find empowering is that district residents went down to McMillan's district in the next election, got people registered to vote, and he was gone. So that kind of effort, where, you know, people getting on buses and traveling hundreds of miles to empower other voters on our own behalf, gives me some hope. But it's, again, that watermelon thing really, I think, is something that we need to just remember. Hopefully we may or may not be so far from that.
So Cosby, you touched on this a little bit in your introduction, but so we all know DC citizens have less of a voice on the federal level, but how does that shape the experience of DC residents, whether that be in their day-to-day lives or whether that be when trying to make efforts for change and fight for racial justice? What does that lack of statehood concretely look like, at least in your experience?
Well, two things. I mean, 10 years ago or so, we passed a referendum around medicinal marijuana as a city, and the House, and Congress overturned the referendum. So the will of the people of the District of Columbia was overturned. I don't think it was medicinal marijuana. I think it had something to do with safe needles. And then recently, you know, the wage, the $15 an hour for service workers in DC, again, the will of the people was for service workers to receive $15 an hour. And the city council, I'm not quite sure how this happened, but they decided that we were misinformed, and they repealed, again, that referendum. And I guess that just wouldn't happen in a state. I mean, I haven't studied the history of referenda around the country, but I just don't think that a state legislature would sort of decide that all the people of the state who voted one way were misinformed and repeal a referenda. It's just absurd to me. So those are two examples of sort of decisions that we have made for ourselves that others, because of the unique situation that we're in, have stepped on.
I think those are really good points on the I guess administrative side and representation side, about how, you know, DC can act in ways that state legislatures would really just not be able to get away with. But I think I can bring a perspective on the voter side, right? That when we think about last year I was doing focus groups with voters, right, in DC, thinking about the implications. What does it mean to vote? What does it matter? Why people decide to vote, right? And you know, talking to older voters, right, they're particularly older voters of color, there was a connection to civil rights movement and the struggle of voting rights, right? But for younger people, there was this attitude of what's the point, right? what is the point when we feel like our vote doesn't really count or matter, right? What is the point when, we feel like we have these, city level representatives who, regardless of what we want, do whatever they want, right? So you really have this place where people don't feel represented by folks in office, right? And so I think that's a fundamental breakdown of what we think about the democratic process, that folks don't even feel the need to participate, right? That their participation doesn't matter, doesn't count, is not meaningful. Thinking about the city level and even in the presidential election level, right? And so I think that has implications for, what happens in this country. We know there are folks who are making decisions, right, every day, right? And regardless of whether or not you think of representation as a trustee or delegate process, if folks are not invested in the process at all, then this has implications for where our country goes next, not just the city of DC.
I just want to kind of reiterate that, like, as a college student who lives in DC, who is obviously in school in Connecticut, right? It's something that I and myself and a lot of friends talk about a lot. It's like, our vote doesn't matter where we're from, might as well vote where, and we have the privilege that we're able to do that, but it is like this weird thing, like, the vote that in DC doesn't seem like it really matters. I also, just to respond to the general question, like, there's a lot of things about living in DC that I think, like you guys touched on, like the idea of voter, but also just recently, I know the whole during the protests following George Floyd's death, there was a lot of militia in DC as well, because we're under this thing called Home Rule Act, where they were basically able to bring in federal troops because we are not a state, and we are part of, like, DC's under federal jurisdiction sometimes. And I think experiences like that are also definitely impacting on DC citizens, where we are, like, in this weird limbo between federal but also, like, our own territory. And this comes in, I mean, I know you're gonna ask later about, like, prisons too, but it is this weird limbo where it's like the seat of our capital, where there's a lot of federal buildings, a lot of federal employees, but we also are our own territory.
Yeah, and so changing topics a little bit, given what we have experienced so far with the coronavirus pandemic, and we know that it has disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities across the United States, do you guys see a connection there between DC's current status and the response to the pandemic by the city, or the experience of residents in the city when it comes to resources to deal with the situation?
We got no funding. We got, like, half as much funding of a state our size. I think it was, like, somewhere like 500 million, whereas states like our size got like 1 billion. And of course, like, it wasn't enough to begin with for any state, but.
I think that's a really good point on the funding side. But I think there are also real implications about what happens when the Capitol shuts down, right? And because DC is this place where it's not just folks who are, who live in the city, who interact with this space. It's folks who are coming in from Maryland, it's folks who are coming in from Virginia. So this has real implications on the economic space in this area. And so there are real economic implications to a DC that is not up and operating, right? Not just for us in this area, but also for folks around the country, because there are so many, so many folks relying on access to the government being in operation, right? One of the things that, and I think one of the things that we can think about is just being very interesting in this moment is that many of your office holders, your representatives, were not here, right? They went home, right? But there were still these calls about, things should be open and things should be in operation, right? But those same folks weren't in their place of work, in operation, right? Things were shut down. So when there were questions about what's going to happen to folks who don't have a job? What's going to happen to folks who are really struggling in this moment? The answer was, we're going to come together really quickly and give folks $1,200. And what does that really do, right? And there's been no response to the continued struggle, right? Continued economic struggle that is continuing to happen right now, right? So I think there is certainly the case that the pandemic has been affecting Black and Brown communities, but we also can't escape from the fact that the atmosphere in DC has been affecting Black and Brown communities for a long time, right? Who's getting pushed out, who's able to stay in the city, who has access, right? It's no secret that where you live dictates your access to transportation, talking about Southeast, right? Anacostia region, right? Where buses go, how access works. So especially now that the metro closes at, what is it, midnight, right? How do you get to work when metro closes at midnight? How do you get around, right? So yes, the pandemic is affecting a lot of things, but we cannot escape from the fact that there have already been impacts on Black and Brown lives in the city. This has just made it worse.
I had what I think is a positive note, because I agree with what's been said. And I know there's going to be a question about education in a minute, but DC schools were supposed to get a 3% increase this year, and actually the city was able to meet that obligation or that commitment, even during the pandemic, because of our city's reserves. And I will say that I think our city's response to the pandemic in terms of what phase we're in and so forth has been, well, more consistent than the federal government. So I do think that there are some bright spots, and I was pleased that the city was able to meet that commitment to the 3% raise for schools. And we'll get to how the pandemic is affecting education, but at least the money is there.
Yeah, so turning next to the criminal justice system, how would you all see a lack of statehood as affecting efforts to reform the criminal justice system and to reform policing, which disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities in DC, especially in Ward 7 and 8?
So I think that becomes an issue. It becomes an issue that's out of DC's hands, really, right? Because the prisons are federal prisons, right? And so it's not just what is DC going to do? How is DC going to make it better? How do we look for representatives in DC to improve the situation? They can't, right? So it's the representatives from other states that people can't vote for, who are responsible for the decision making at the federal level about how things work in federal prisons, reform, et cetera, right? So there's only so much that DC itself can do when there are all these questions and responsibility being taken away from DC itself. It's, to our 535 other representatives who have to make a decision, right? For a city that can't advocate for itself in this position.
I have nothing more to add to that. It is like we do have federal prisons, and there's not much we can do at this point. And maybe with statehood, possibly, but we're kind of in this weird situation.
And I'll just add that while we do have the DC jail, when people commit crimes in DC, because there is no longer a Lorton out in Virginia, DC folks are getting sent to Ohio to serve their prison terms. So imagine the impact on families. And so again, that I don't know what the answer is. If we're a state, how does that change? But right now, the reality is, if you are found guilty of a crime and you spend time in DC jail as you await trial, and then you're shipped off hundreds of miles away. And your family may or may not have the means to come see you. Where are they going to stay? There are people who have set up a hotel essentially for the families of DC incarcerated in Ohio so that they can, you know, keep their families together. But this is the kind of challenge that we have. And I don't know what the answer is or how it changes if DC is a state.
Can I add to that point really quickly? Because I think that's a really good one, Cosby, to bring up here, that, you know, if there's the travel component of it, but also this component of prisons are starting to do this video component, right? And so, you know, at least with an in-person activity, right, you have some semblance of privacy, not completely, right, but you can sit in a room or sit across from someone. Someone could be listening, but, right, there's at least a bit of semblance of privacy, right? If it's a video call, right, where, or a phone call, right, everything you say is subject to listening, right? The federal government has that right. So anything you say in that space, right, they can listen, they can keep track of it, et cetera, right? So I have friends who are defense attorneys, right? And so parts of their job, right, is to just watch, right, you know, those video calls to make sure their clients don't say anything wrong to their family member. Don't make a slip up, right? Because those things could be used against you, even in just talking to your family. Now, some of those things we know would happen regardless, right? That, you know, video calls and phone calls, they've always been subject to surveillance, right? But if you don't have another option, right? You don't have the option to go visit, then what do you have? All you have is that, right? And so in some ways, there's something to be said about privileges and freedom and, you know, self-incrimination, right? And that's not to speak to, you know, people doing wrong or bad. I'm not even speaking to that point, but, you know, people have rights and privileges that they should be able to exercise. And if you can't see your family in person, right, and even if it's not even about self-incrimination, right, you should have a right to be able to say something to your family, right? And I love you, and a hello, how are the kids? How are things going, right? If you don't even have the option to see somebody face to face, right, every communication that you have is subject to surveillance. So.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good point. So turning now kind of to our last set of questions, looking at youth and education. So following up sort of on that question, but also adding in the education element, how do you all see the lack of statehood and the lack of local control impacting both youth justice and education for students in the district?
Well, I'll say that, first of all, my two sons were in a charter school, and I teach full-time at a charter school in Anacostia, Thurgood Marshall Academy. In 20 years, the 83,000 or so public school students in this city, we've gone to half charter. So half of those students are in charter schools, in part because when an idea catches on and members of Congress get excited about it and funders get excited about it, DC becomes like a petri dish. And so when the idea of charter schools caught on, DC was a place where we could experiment. I'll never forget Vincent Gray when he was mayor at the DC sort of open house for charter schools, announcing proudly that no city had as many charter schools as DC except for New Orleans. And I thought, I'm not sure that that's really something that you want to tout, considering that New Orleans had a natural disaster that caused the charter schools to swoop in. But my point is that DC has sometimes been a petri dish of experimentation, and the charter schools, there's positive and negative, but here we are at half. In 20 years, half of our students are now in charters. And I think, again, if it's a different story. You know, point to another state where half the students are in charter schools.
So I'm not an education expert, but I think those are that question that Cosby or that point that Cosby raised about, you know, half the schools being charter schools. I think that matters for just how we think about outcomes for students moving forward, particularly because, you know, there are sometimes charter schools have requirements for entry, right? There can be barriers to entry for some students. And so inherently, right, there might be questions of, inherently this brings up questions of who has access, right? And what does this mean for your life outcomes? We know that education can matter, right? For where you go next, right? We're so, in this space, right, in this time, you know, folks are certainly thinking about what education means, right? And where you go next with your education, particularly because, right, we're thinking about questions of student loans. We're thinking about questions of, you know, can people get a job after they go to college, right? I know that some of you might be thinking of those questions right now, right, as you consider your next steps, right, particularly in this economic environment. Well, there are folks who might not even get the opportunity to think about a college education, right? And so, and this is not a specific case just for DC, right? We know that all cities have these questions raised, right? But when there are barriers to entry, when there can be barriers to entry for education, I think it raises questions of what happens next for some of our most vulnerable students. And that's not to say that all charter schools have requirements for entry, but some of them do, right? And so, and those might be some of the schools that have, you know, the better outcomes, right? Those are the ones who are sending the student, perhaps sending the students to the Harvards and Yales, et cetera. And so just something to think about. Not, I'm in no way like trying to down charter schools or anything like that, but I think we should, where DC stands on education, right, is something to think about.
I don't have much expertise in this, so I don't want to kind of, seems like Cosby and Professor Scott said enough.
I do wonder if we will revisit the idea of mayoral control of the schools at some point. I guess the Mayor Fenty got sort of mayoral control about 15 years ago, and at what some would say was a low point in our school's history. And, you know, the Board of Education doesn't have very much power. So it'll be interesting to see if democracy makes more of a comeback as time goes on. You know, just for example, DC, the head of DC Public Schools is a chancellor right now, and that is essentially because to be a superintendent, you have to have a PhD, you have to have a doctorate in education. And you don't have to have that to be a chancellor. So I'm not saying that we've lowered the bar, but educationally, we've lowered the bar. I have a lot of respect for the people who have been chancellors. But again, when you have mayoral control, the mayor says, okay, well, I want the person to run the school. I don't need them to have a doctorate. So I need a chancellor. I guess they could have called him anything. But we'll see if what decision we make around, do we really want the mayor to have so much control over the schools as time goes on?
Yeah. So looking towards sort of the students who are here today, especially students who are maybe not from the district and have moved here as part of their college experience and are now kind of navigating, finding this new home and realizing what all of these problems and inequities that exist here are. What do you think that we as students can do to advocate for statehood and racial justice, whether those two issues are directly tied together or separate, and also continue to sort of recognize our presence as people coming into the district who are often seen as gentrifiers and who have had those negative impacts on the district as well?
That's a really big question. So I think on the student side, I think one of the things you can do just as being you is recognizing the spaces that you're coming into, that some of these neighborhoods that, that you might be trying to rent in might be neighborhoods that have traditionally been, Black neighborhoods, or traditionally been held by certain people. So being conscious of those spaces, right? And so, and it's a complicated issue, right? Because you're looking for a place to live, and then someone's offering you a place to go, right? But I think there is something to be said about conscious choice being made about spaces, right? You all popularizing a place to live can change the dynamics of a neighborhood, right? There have been these conversations, particularly around Southeast, about changing the composition of those neighborhoods, right? In particular, I think there was a conversation about making it Georgetown East, right? So being conscious of, how, folks are trying to build up apartment buildings, et cetera, in that area, and changing the composition of who lives there and who's able to afford living there. So I think it's being conscious about those spaces and who has traditionally been there, right? And making choices about where you choose to live, right? Does it help the residents who traditionally been there to take up spaces in Anacostia? Maybe not, right? Will you enjoy your life in what is it? Where are the places you guys go now? Where's that place off DuPont? Where all the bars and such are, right? Does it serve you better to live over there? Probably, right? You'll probably have a better time, right? And you won't be taken up. You won't be an unconscious consumer of space in the DC area, right? So I challenge you all to be conscious consumers of space. I think that's the best way I can say it, right? And in regards to advocating for statehood, I think one thing that you can think about here is that this struggle for DC statehood is not separate from what's happening in Puerto Rico or how we're thinking about Puerto Rico. So thinking about, I think one of the things that you guys can do or think about as activists, right, in this moment in time is that the struggle is not separate, right? They're connected struggles. And one of the things you can do as a conscious consumer of space in DC is to think about what's happening in other spaces and how you can do advocacy together, right? Because coalition building is important, right? To having your voice be heard, and also not just being heard for DC, but being heard for other groups, right? Being conscious of what's happening in other spaces, not just DC, right, will be important for how we think about moving forward here, right? Because these things are happening in parallel, they're not happening separately. And so, inevitably, right, there will be conversations about whether or not, if DC, right, what about this other space and what about this other space? So connecting yourself to other struggles, right? Connecting with office holders who do have power and are really thinking about these decisions or how DC stands is important. And honestly, I would say that for you all from other spaces, right, from other states, where you are having, where you do have, a representative that can vote, that has value, right? Because you can say to this person, I'm in your district, right? And I'd like to talk to you about something. Just like the story that was told by by Cosby about people going out of DC to a office holders district, right? You can use your power as folks coming from other spaces to talk to representatives, right? I've never seen a representative say, no, I don't want to hear your concerns, constituent from my district, right? That just doesn't happen, right? So being conscious of how you can use, being conscious consumers in DC and being conscious of the power that you hold is important here as well. I hope that was clear.
I mean, I would encourage students to just find out what your representatives, what your congressmen and women, what your senator's stance is on DC statehood, and just decide for yourself, does their stance hold water for you? You know, are they giving you the well, the flag would be jacked up if we had 51 stars. I mean, are they giving you that level of answer, or are they giving you the Wyoming answer, something about, well, DC and this has a similar population to Wyoming, but you know, just find out what their answer is, and just decide for yourself, like, does it hold water? I think that would be helpful. Just get educated on what your representatives' stance is on DC statehood, and then I think you'll be moved or not from there. And obviously, anytime you're in conversation with people about Washington, hopefully you can help people understand that inside the Beltway is not the term inside the Beltway gets used really pejoratively, and inside the Beltway are, again, what, 800,000 now, about 800,000 people who are disenfranchised, who are just regular working folks who I think, as we get closer to the high population that we've ever had. So I think in World War II, we had our highest population around 900,000. Not too long ago, we were adding citizens, we were adding new residents at 1,100 a month, that kind of clip. I have confidence that the statehood issue is going to come to the fore again as our population goes up. And part of it is folks like you asking questions of your representatives.
Yeah, I definitely think for those of you who aren't from DC, talking to your representatives, like Cosby pointed out, and seeing their stance. I also think just having conversations with people, as I'm in college, and again, I'm not in DC, there's a lot of people who just don't realize what DC is. A lot of people say DC is not a real place. DC is not real. Like it's a territory. It's not part of the US. And so having conversations that it is a real place with real people, right? Going against that Tom Cotton argument that there's no real people in DC, and kind of discussing the inequities in DC and inequities in terms of disenfranchisement in general, and also just the link to racial injustice, I think is really important.
Before we move on to the next question, I'm going to take this opportunity to plug that 51 for 51 is having an advocacy day next Thursday, where you all, if you sign up, if you're on our email list, you will have gotten the link. If you're not and you would like it, you can message me, and you'll be able to go talk to representatives. If your senators, if your senator has not signed on to the bill, they will pair you with them. If not, they'll pair you with someone else who has not signed on. And that is a great opportunity to be able to advocate and ask those questions. But we're going to close now with our last question, which is just, what's one important takeaway that you all would like to close with and that you think is just absolutely essential for us to know as we leave this panel?
I think one of the things that I think you all should go away with is that the outlook for youth activism is one that is very bright, right? And you all taking stances and being engaged in politics is important, and taking stances now and trying to be heard by your representatives is even more important, because they count you out on election day, right? They think it's, your grandmothers your mothers, your fathers, who are the voters and the ones who have opinions. And so being active and engaging in activism in this moment, being conscious consumers of knowledge, being careful about not just how you engage in this space, but in your home spaces, and the issues that you decide to take up are important. Because again, right, on election day, they count you out. The election algorithms on all of them, right? We're around the time, right, it's September, right? But in about a couple weeks, right, as we get closer to November, they're gonna start calling people, you know, asking people if they're registered to vote, if they're engaged in politics, et cetera, right? I doubt it very seriously that all of you will be getting calls. They'll be calling me, right? They'll be calling my mom, my grandma, making sure my grandma gets to the polls, right? Your grandmothers get to the polls, right? But I think your engagement in questions of policy like this is meaningful, because it shows that youth activism is strong and that young people are engaged and interested in the outlook for this country. So I'll leave it like that.
Takeaway for me is just my hope, to piggyback on that, that you stay engaged in the issues. And I think at some point, people will look back on when DC becomes a state, people will look back and sort of say, why was it ever not a state? And so and how quickly terminology or ideas can catch fire in the populace. I mean, who was talking about defunding the police 6 months ago? Let's get DC statehood to be the kind of issue that everybody's talking about, and hopefully we can keep them. There's no way to keep all the misinformation out, but let's get to the point where DC statehood is a no-brainer, because it just makes sense to enfranchise close to 1 million people, and that's going to have to come from folks who are DC residents and who are students in DC and live elsewhere, being part of that conversation to just sort of turn the tide and make it a common sense issue.
Yeah, I think for one, I think there's a big idea, and this is general, not necessarily related to DC, that in November, if Biden wins, that's going to fix everything. And I think that's not true. We need to keep fighting. We need to keep pushing the momentum. It's the first time that DC statehood has been on the Senate floor, or has passed the House and is going to be on the Senate, and that's big, but we're going to have to keep fighting for that and for other important issues, because even if we go blue in November, that's not going to fix everything. And I think that's a really important message to get across. And I also think just having these conversations, like, thank you guys for being here, but talk about it with your friends who weren't here, who weren't able to make it, and having these conversations just continuously so that more people are aware, I think, is really important.
Oh, Hannah, I'm glad you brought that point up. I think that we can certainly bring pressure on the Senate to at least have a discussion about statehood. Just do your job. Like, I think if we could just get the phrase, do your job, you don't have to, it might get voted down, but do your job, have the discussion, bring it to the floor. You know, in the same way, it didn't work for Merrick Garland, but so this is part two, like, Senate, do your job. Just bring it to the floor for discussion. There aren't many Americans who would say it's not even worth a discussion. Maybe that's where you start with your representative. What's your stance on bringing the issue of DC statehood just to the floor of the Senate for discussion? I'd like to hear what they have to say.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And I hope that for those of you that have attended, this has been informative and educational, and a good way to start off the year for Students for DC Statehood. And yeah, if you are not a member of the club yet and you would like to be, as I said, you can just email me or message me in the Zoom chat right now. But let's give all of our panelists a round of applause, virtual applause at least. And thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thanks for having us. Stay engaged, everybody.
Yes, thank you for having us.